Welcome to Nocturnal Tales. Tonight we leave London by motor coach on a wet October afternoon, our detective immaculate, his companion suspicious, and their destination a village called Brackmere in the Hollow, where they have been promised views, silence, and an excellent omelette. They will receive none of these. The Undertaker's holiday begins when the coach crashes into a ditch, a storm cuts the telephone line, and 9 stranded passengers take shelter at a crooked old inn called the Merry Mourner, where a 10th guest, a man who signed the register as Mr. Lugg, has locked himself in room 3 and will not ring for supper. As always, this tale is inspired by the spirit of the great Golden Age crime writers, but the plot, characters, and text you're about to hear are entirely our own creation. This episode is brought to you by the listeners who support Nocturnal Tales on Patreon and by those who help with one-off tips on Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. If you'd like to support our work, you'll find all the links in the description. And a quick note: our ebook, Nocturnal Tales, The Collected Mysteries, Volume 2, is available now for $3.99. 8 earlier mysteries, rewritten and expanded for the page, with original Art Deco illustrations throughout. You can find it on Patreon, Gumroad, and Buy Me a Coffee. Links in the description. Now settle in as the landlord opens the door to room 3. The oil lamp throws gold across a cold supper and a dead man, and in the dead man's hand a small white card reads, "One of us is already dead." Chapter 1. The Wrong Corpse. It was entirely Poirot's fault. I say this with the fullest affection for my old friend, but also with the stern accuracy of a man who has spent several years being dragged, against his better judgment, into murders, scandals, international conspiracies, and on one occasion a luncheon at which the fish was served cold. Poirot had decided that we required air. "Air, Hastings," he had said, standing before the mirror and attending to his moustaches with the gravity of a bishop blessing a cathedral. "The lungs, they must have the air. The mind, too, must breathe." "My mind breathes very well in London," I told him. "No, in London your mind coughs." And so, on a wet October afternoon, we found ourselves in a motor coach belonging to the Westshire Scenic Excursion Company, heading toward a little village called Brackmere in the Hollow, where Poirot had been promised views, silence, and an excellent omelette. I distrusted all 3 at once. The coach contained, besides ourselves, 8 passengers and a driver whose confidence in his own abilities appeared to be founded entirely on guesswork. There was Miss Lavinia Crimp, a large widow dressed in violet, who had buried 3 husbands and spoke of them as though they had been minor inconveniences sent to test her housekeeping. There was her nephew, Mr. Arnold Pye, a thin young man with damp hands, and the expression of one who expected life to ask him for money. There was Major Bletchley, retired, red-faced, and furious with peace. Beside him sat Miss Euphemia Quill, a lady novelist of crime stories, who wore spectacles on a chain and looked at everyone as though mentally arranging their corpses. There was also Mr. Septimus Goringer, an undertaker on holiday, which I thought showed an unhealthy lack of imagination. He was a long, black-coated man with a soft voice and white hands. Every time the coach jolted, he smiled apologetically, as though accepting delivery of a customer. Completing our party were a nervous curate, Reverend Puddlewick, a young woman named Iris Bell, pale and pretty in a threadbare sort of way, and a commercial traveller, Mr. Fred Spinks, who sold patent collapsible bath seats and believed this to be a contribution to civilization. Poirot sat very upright, his little patent leather shoes planted firmly together. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured. "Already there is the drama. There is nothing dramatic about a coach trip in the rain. You are wrong. There is always drama where there are human beings trapped together." At that exact moment the coach gave a violent lurch, mounted something that was either a bank or a small geological event, and slid sideways into a ditch. There was a crash, a shriek from Mrs. Crimp, an oath from Major Bletchley, and a curious metallic groan from the engine. Mr. Spinks's sample bath seat sprang open and trapped Reverend Puddlewick by the ankle. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then the driver turned round and said with splendid calm, "Bit of trouble." It was worse than a bit. The front wheel had snapped clean away, the road behind us was blocked by a fallen tree, and the rain had increased from unpleasant to biblical. The driver, after inspecting the damage, announced that there was an inn about half a mile across the moor. "What is it called?" asked Miss Quill with interest. "The Merry Mourner," said the driver. There was a silence. Mr. Goringer smiled. How cheerful. We set out on foot, a melancholy procession crossing the wet moor under a sky the colour of dishwater. Poirot was deeply offended by the mud. Each step seemed to him a personal insult from England. "Barbarous," he said. "A country which permits mud in such quantities is not truly civilized. At least we shall have shelter soon." "And perhaps," said Mr. Gorringe softly behind us, "a fire." I turned. "Do undertakers enjoy fires?" "When they are not professional," he said. I could not decide whether this was wit or confession. The Merry Mourner stood alone at the edge of Brackmere Hollow, a crooked old inn of black beams and yellow windows, crouched against the rain like a guilty conscience. Inside it was warm, smoky, and decorated with a number of hunting prints in which foxes, hounds, and gentlemen all looked equally doomed. The landlord, Mr. Abel Trench, received us with the expression of a man who had long suspected the world of plotting against him and now had proof. His wife, a narrow woman with sharp eyes, counted us twice before offering rooms. "We're full enough already," she said. "With whom?" demanded Mrs. Crimp. "With Mr. Lugg." "Who is Mr. Lugg?" asked Poirot. The landlord glanced toward the ceiling. "Guest in number 3, came yesterday. Wanted no disturbance." "Then he has chosen the wrong inn," said Miss Quill. "We are practically a travelling disturbance." Rooms were arranged after much complaint. As the village telephone line had been brought down by the storm, we were told that no assistance could be summoned until morning. We were stranded. Dinner was served in the parlour at 8. It was an extraordinary meal. The soup tasted as though it had lost an argument with a turnip. The roast beef was of a firmness rarely found outside architecture. Poirot looked at his plate with the sorrow of a man attending the funeral of appetite. Mrs. Crimp, however, ate magnificently. "I have always believed," she announced, "that disaster is best met with gravy." Major Bletchley grunted. "Country's gone soft. In my day, if a coach crashed, one simply walked on and said nothing about it." "Did people die?" asked Miss Quill. "Often." "How efficient?" The Undertaker gave a little cough that might have been laughter. During coffee, the landlord came in and whispered to his wife. She stiffened. "What is it?" asked Mrs. Crimp, who believed all whispers belonged to her by right. Mr. Trench looked uncomfortable. "It's Mr. Lugg. He was to have rung for supper. Hasn't done." "Perhaps he is asleep," said Iris Bell. "He left strict orders," said Mrs. Trench, "that if he did not ring by 8:30, we were to go up." "That is either very cautious," said Poirot, "or very theatrical." Miss Quill's eyes gleamed. "May we come?" "No," said the landlord. We all went. Number 3 was at the end of a low passage. The landlord knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, then opened the door. The room was lit by a single oil lamp. A fire burned low. A travelling cloak lay over a chair. On the table stood an untouched tray. Cold meat, bread, mustard, and a glass of port. On the bed lay a man. He was dressed in a dark suit, his boots still on, his face turned slightly toward the wall. At first I thought he slept. Then I saw the unnatural angle of the head and the dark mark behind one ear. Mrs. Crimp looked in, sniffed, and said, "Well, that is inconvenient." Reverend Puddlewick whispered, "Good Lord." Mr. Gorange stepped forward with professional interest, then stopped. Poirot had raised one small hand. "No one moves." He went to the bed, bent close, then looked at the tray, the window, the fireplace, and finally at the dead man's left hand. There was something clutched in it. A small white card. Poirot removed it delicately with his handkerchief and read aloud, "One of us is already dead." For a moment the only sound was the rain beating against the window. Then Major Bletchley said, "Damned silly thing to write to a corpse." Poirot turned, his eyes very green and very bright. "On the contrary, Major, it may be the most sensible remark anyone has made this evening." Chapter 2. The Guest in Number 3. It is my experience that when a man is found murdered in an inn during a storm, the English instinct is not to investigate, but to blame the weather. Mr. Trench, the landlord, did so at once. "It's this rain," he said gloomily. "Brings things out." "Mushrooms, perhaps," said Poirot. "But not, as a rule, murderers." Mrs. Trench had retreated to the doorway and stood there with her arms folded, her thin mouth pressed into a line. She looked less shocked by death than offended by the disturbance to her linen schedule. "Who was he?" I asked. The landlord scratched his cheek. "Signed the book as Mr. Edwin Lugg." "From where?" "London." "That narrows it," murmured Miss Euphemia Quill. "Only 7 million suspects removed at a stroke." She had produced a notebook from somewhere about her person and was writing rapidly. I noticed Poirot eyeing her with disapproval. "Madame," he said, "this is not the first chapter of one of your romances." "No," she said. "Too much soup." Poirot turned back to the corpse. Mr. Lugg, if Lugg he was, had been a man of perhaps 50, stout, dark-haired, with a small scar at the corner of his mouth. His clothes were good, though not new. There was no luggage visible, except for one leather case under the washstand. The window was fastened from within. I pointed this out with some satisfaction. "Locked room, Poirot." He gave me a look of suffering patience. "Hastings, when you say those words, I feel always that you expect the murderer to have dissolved into vapor. It is rarely so convenient." The door was unlocked. "Exactly. Therefore the room is not locked. It is merely a room." I felt this was rather a legal distinction, but before I could protest, Mr. Gorange spoke. "The blow was delivered from behind," he said softly. "Heavy instrument. Efficient." We all looked at him. He blinked. "One notices things in my profession." "Do undertakers often inspect the cause of death?" demanded Major Bletchley. "Only when the doctor has been careless." The Major disliked this answer visibly, chiefly because it was better than anything he had prepared. Poirot examined the small white card again. It was plain, thick, and expensive. The words had been printed in block capitals with black ink. Reverend Puddlewick swallowed. "A threat?" "A joke?" suggested Fred Spinks. "If so," said Miss Quill, "it lacks warmth." Mrs. Crimp leaned over the card, peered at it, and gave a short sniff. "I have seen worse handwriting from solicitors." "It is not handwriting, madam," said Poirot. "It is printed carefully. Someone wished not to be known." "Cowardice," said Major Bletchley. "Prudence," said Mr. Gorange. "Marketing," said Mr. Spinks. "A phrase like that sticks in the memory." Nobody replied to him. Poirot requested that all of us return to the parlour while he and I remained with the landlord. This caused immediate protest, for nothing annoys a group of English people more than being denied the full enjoyment of a catastrophe. "I have a right to know whether I am in danger," said Mrs. Crimp. "Madame," said Poirot, "at present we have 1 dead man and 9 living people. Statistically, you are doing well." She stared at him, uncertain whether she had been reassured or insulted. At last they went downstairs, though Miss Quill departed backwards in order not to miss any detail. Once the passage was empty, Poirot opened the leather case. Inside were 2 shirts, a razor, a packet of letters tied with blue string, a small framed photograph turned face down, and a brown envelope containing £30 in notes. Poirot did not touch the letters at first. He looked instead at the photograph. It showed a young woman in a white dress standing by the sea. Her face had been scratched out. "A domestic tragedy?" I said. "Perhaps, or the appearance of one." He then examined the dead man's hands. On the 3rd finger of the left hand there was the pale mark of a ring recently removed. "He was married," I observed, "or wished to appear unmarried." "Really, Poirot, you make even a wedding ring sound criminal." "My friend, marriage is often the first chapter of crime." I thought of Mrs. Crimp's 3 husbands and found this difficult to dispute. The murder weapon was not obvious. The poker by the fire was clean. The candlestick was too light. The washstand jug had no mark upon it. Poirot knelt by the hearth and picked up with tweezers from his pocket a tiny black flake. "Coal?" I asked. "No." "Paint?" "Perhaps." "Blood?" He looked at me sadly. "You have the imagination melodramatic, Hastings. It is soot." "That seems rather ordinary." "Nothing is ordinary until it has been explained." We then searched the victim's pockets. There was a silver watch stopped at 20 minutes past 8, a handkerchief, a railway ticket from Paddington to Westcombe Junction, and a receipt from a London pawnbroker for 1 gold signet ring. Poirot's eyebrows rose. "The ring recently removed," I said, "or recently redeemed." From below came the muffled sound of argument. Mrs. Crimp's voice was carrying upward, rich and indignant. Poirot listened. "They begin," he said. "Begin what?" "To arrange themselves. It is always so after murder. At first there is confusion. Then each person finds a posture: innocence, outrage, fear, helpfulness, humour, stupidity. Very often the posture is more revealing than the truth." We went downstairs. The parlour had become a small parliament of alarm. Major Bletchley stood with his back to the fire, as though commanding troops at Ypres. Mrs. Crimp occupied the largest chair and had somehow acquired brandy. Mr. Spinks was demonstrating the collapsible bath seat to no one. Reverend Puddlewick sat pale and silent. Iris Bell stared into the fire. Mr. Gorringe stood near the window watching the rain. Miss Quill had taken the seat nearest the door, pen ready. Poirot entered and everyone stopped speaking. It was Mr. Arnold Pye who broke the silence. "I don't see why we should all be kept here like prisoners." "You prefer to walk the moor in the storm?" asked Poirot. "No, but morally I object." "Ah," said Poirot, "morally you may go wherever you like." Mrs. Crimp snapped, "Sit down, Arnold." He sat. Poirot warmed his small hands at the fire. "I ask of you all a little cooperation. Until the police arrive in the morning, no one leaves the inn, no one enters number 3, and no one destroys, conceals, washes, burns, eats, drinks, folds, posts, buries, or improves anything that may be evidence." Mr. Gorringe smiled faintly. "You include burying?" "With you, monsieur, I'm especially precise." The Undertaker bowed. Miss Quill raised her pen. "May one ask whether Mr. Lugg was killed before or after dinner?" "One may ask anything, said Poirot. "One may not always receive the answer." At that moment, Iris Bell rose so suddenly that her chair scraped the floor. "I feel faint." The curate hurried toward her, but she waved him off. "No, I only need air." Poirot's eyes rested on her. "The air outside is very wet, mademoiselle." She looked at him, and for the first time I saw real terror in her face. "I knew him," she said. The room went still. Mrs. Crimp lowered her glass. "You knew Mr. Lugg?" Iris Bell shook her head. "No," she whispered. "That is just it." Poirot moved a fraction closer. "Explain yourself, mademoiselle." Her lips trembled. "The dead man upstairs is not Mr. Lugg." Before we continue, a quick note from Nocturnal Tales. A few listeners have asked where they can find more of our stories. On YouTube, we now release one episode per week, and we keep only the 10 most recent episodes available there. When a new story is uploaded, the oldest one quietly leaves the YouTube shelf. But if you would like to hear more, you can listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts completely free. We release 3 brand new episodes every week there, and you can also find the full Nocturnal Tales back catalogue. To be clear, listening on Spotify and Apple Podcasts is 100% free. The links are always in the description. And for those who wish to support us more directly and have the means to do so, you can join us on Patreon from $2.99 a month. Patreon members receive early access, ad-free listening, and help us keep making these stories, one mystery at a time. Thank you for listening, and now, let us return to the tale. Chapter 3. The Man Who Was Not Lugg. There are moments in life when a room appears to inhale. The parlour of the Merry Mourner did so then. Even the fire seemed to draw itself back, as though unwilling to be associated with us. "The dead man," said Poirot gently, "is not Mr. Lugg." Iris Bell stood with one hand gripping the back of her chair. She was very pale, but there was nothing theatrical in her distress. Indeed, she looked like a young woman who had spent some years avoiding drama and had now found it waiting for her at a country inn with bad soup. "No," she said. "His name is Mr. Paul Varney." "Ah," said Miss Quill, writing. "Excellent name." Poirot turned his head slowly. "Madame, I beg you not to enjoy yourself quite so visibly." Miss Quill shut her notebook halfway, which was, I felt, a compromise rather than an act of obedience. Mrs. Crimp stared at Iris. "Who is Paul Varney?" "A man I hoped never to see again." "That," said Mr. Gorringe softly, "is often the beginning of acquaintance." Major Bletchley barked, "What did he do?" Iris hesitated. Her eyes went from face to face, finding no refuge in any of them. He was a solicitor's clerk, or said he was. 3 years ago he handled certain papers after my father died. Money disappeared. So did he. "Your inheritance?" asked Poirot. What little there was. Arnold Pye gave a faint, involuntary laugh. Mrs. Crimp turned upon him. "Arnold, if poverty amuses you, I shall leave you some." The laugh died at once. Poirot said, "You did not know he was here?" "No, I had no idea. When I saw him upstairs—" She stopped and shivered. I recognized the scar by his mouth. "And you did not speak before?" "I was afraid." "Of being suspected. Of being believed." That struck me as a sadder answer than any denial. Poirot nodded as though she had given him something of value. "You will sit, mademoiselle. Hastings, a little brandy." Mrs. Crimp lifted her glass possessively. "Not mine." "Hastings," said Poirot, Another brandy. I procured it from the landlord, who brought the bottle as one might carry an unexploded shell. The revelation had done nothing to improve the company. If anything, it had made us all more civil, which is often worse. Major Bletchley stopped blustering and watched Iris with open suspicion. Miss Quill pretended not to write while writing. Reverend Puddlewick murmured Christian comfort in a voice suggesting he had never found it very reliable. Mr. Spinks cleared his throat several times, perhaps in the hope that someone would ask about bath seats. Poirot, meanwhile, addressed the landlord. "You saw this man arrive?" Mr. Trench nodded. "Yesterday afternoon. Wet through, though it wasn't raining then." "That is interesting." "It was foggy." "That is less interesting, but still possible." "He signed as Edwin Lugg, paid in advance." "Did he receive visitors?" "None that I saw." Mrs. Trench, who had appeared behind her husband with the noiselessness of bad news, said, "He asked about the coach." "What coach?" asked Poirot. "The one you came on. Whether it passed this way today?" That produced another silence. Fred Spinks said, "Then he was expecting someone." "Or avoiding someone," said Miss Quill. "Or both," said Mr. Gorringe. Major Bletchley glared at him. "Must you sound so pleased by mortality?" "Mortality is the only dependable trade in England." "I thought you were on holiday." "I am. That is why I have not measured him." This remark did not comfort the room. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back and walked once, very carefully, across the hearthrug. "We have, then, a man who comes under a false name, asks about our coach, orders that he be checked if he does not ring by 8:30, and is then found dead with a message in his hand." "One of us is already dead," murmured Reverend Puddlewick. "Yes. A curious phrase. Not one of you. Not someone here, but one of us." "It implies," said Miss Quill, "that the writer includes himself in the party." "Or herself," said Mrs. Crimp. "Or itself," said Mr. Spinks hopefully. "Could be a secret society." Everyone looked at him. "I read magazines," he added, as if this explained both the remark and the condition of his mind. Poirot said, "Mr. Trench, who else is in the inn?" "No one. Only us. The wife, stable boy, kitchen girl." "Where is the stable boy?" "In the stable." "One admires the logic." "The kitchen girl's gone to bed," said Mrs. Trench. "At 9 o'clock?" asked Miss Quill. "She has morals," said Mrs. Trench. Miss Quill looked as though she might write that down too. Poirot requested that the guest book be brought. Mr. Trench fetched it from the hall desk. The pages smelt faintly of damp leather and spilled ale. The latest entry was clear enough. Edwin Lugg, London. The handwriting was neat, upright, and oddly old-fashioned. Poirot compared it with the printed card. "No," he murmured. The card was done slowly, by someone anxious to disguise. This signature was done quickly, by someone used to the name. "But if he was Varney," I said, "why would he be used to signing Lugg?" "An excellent question, Hastings. You see? The country air already improves the intellect." I felt this praise might have been more generous if it had not sounded surprised. The landlord then remembered something. "He had a parcel?" Poirot turned. "What parcel?" "Longish, wrapped in brown paper, said it was fishing rods." "In October?" said Major Bletchley. "I have known fishermen," said Mrs. Crimp. "They are not governed by reason." "Where is it now?" asked Poirot. The landlord looked blank. "In his room, I suppose." "It was not there," I said. Everyone looked at me. I was rather pleased to have noticed something before Poirot, until I saw from his expression that he had noticed it first, and had merely allowed me the crumb of triumph. "No," said Poirot. "It was not there." Mrs. Trench folded her arms. Then he took it out. "Dead men," said Mr. Gorringe, "are poor at errands." The rain struck hard against the windows. Somewhere in the old inn a board creaked. It was not a sinister sound in itself, but by that time we were prepared to suspect even carpentry. Poirot asked each of us, briefly, where we had been between 8 and past. We had all been, in theory, together at dinner. In practice, this was less helpful than it sounded. Mrs. Crimp had gone to fetch smelling salts from her room, though nobody had fainted. Major Bletchley had stepped outside to inspect the weather, as if considering whether to discipline it. Mr. Spinks had visited the hall to retrieve a pamphlet. Miss Quill had gone to sharpen a pencil. Reverend Puddlewick had retired briefly for prayer, a phrase that made Mrs. Trench look suspicious. Mr. Gorringe had been absent too, but explained that he had been washing his hands. "Before death was discovered?" asked Major Bletchley. "One should not wait," said the Undertaker. "And you, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked Iris. "I was here," she said, "all the time." Arnold Pye said suddenly, "No, you weren't." Iris turned on him. He swallowed. "You went into the passage, just for a minute." "I did not." "Yes, you did. During the coffee." Mrs. Crimp leaned forward. "Arnold, do not embroider. It is a disgusting habit in men." "I saw her." Iris's face hardened. "You saw nothing." Poirot looked from one to the other with great interest. Then came a knock, not at the parlour door. At the front door of the inn. 3 slow knocks. No one moved. The storm roared. The knocks came again. Mr. Trench went unwillingly into the hall and opened the door. A man stood outside in the rain, hatless, soaked to the skin, with blood on one cheek and a torn travelling coat. He looked past the landlord into the parlour. "My name," he said hoarsely, "is Edwin Lugg." And then he fell face first onto the mat. Chapter 4. Mr. Lugg arrives late. There is something profoundly unsettling about a dead man being replaced by the correct one. Mr. Edwin Lugg lay on the mat of the Merry Mourner, dripping rainwater onto the boards and bleeding in a restrained, apologetic manner from a cut along his cheek. In life, as I later learned, he was a man of steady habits, mild digestion, and a horror of melodrama. Fate had therefore chosen him for an evening at our inn, with its usual lack of tact. Reverend Puddlewick was the first to recover. "He is alive?" Mr. Gorringe bent over him. "Regrettably for my profession, yes." Mrs. Crimp gave a snort. "Then move him before he ruins the hall carpet." Between the landlord, the Major, and myself, we carried Mr. Lugg into the parlour and placed him on the sofa. Poirot stood apart, watching with that stillness of his, which always told me his mind was moving very fast indeed. Mrs. Trench brought towels, brandy, and a basin of water, though she did each act as if the wounded man had personally inconvenienced her. After a few minutes, Mr. Lugg opened his eyes. "Where am I?" "The Merry Mourner," said Miss Quill. His eyes widened. "God help me." "A common review," murmured Mr. Spinks. "I was thinking of putting it in their visitors' book." Poirot stepped forward. "Monsieur, you are Edwin Lugg?" "Yes." "Of London?" "Battersea." Poirot seemed to accept this distinction gravely. "And the man upstairs who signed your name?" Mr. Lugg struggled to sit up. "Varney." Iris Bell drew in a sharp breath. Poirot did not turn, but I saw that he heard it. "You knew him?" "Knew of him," said Lugg, "more than was healthy." Mrs. Crimp settled herself in the largest chair. "Then say something useful before another corpse appears. I dislike waste." Mr. Lugg looked at her with the dazed expression of a man wondering whether concussion could invent widows. I am a clerk in the office of Messrs. Brindle and Shaw, solicitors. Paul Varney was formerly employed there. He stole documents, money, identities when convenient, and finally vanished. We believed he had gone abroad. But he had not, said Poirot. No. 3 days ago my employer received a letter. Varney wrote that he possessed certain papers which would ruin a client if made public. He demanded money. I was sent to meet him here. At this inn? Yes. Tomorrow morning. Why tomorrow? Because he said he would not deal until all parties were present. All parties? Asked Poirot softly. Mr. Lugg looked around the room, and for the first time fear entered his face. There were to be others. The parlour went very quiet. Major Bletchley said, "What others?" "I don't know. The letter said only that the people concerned would arrive by chance, by accident, or by arrangement." "By accident," said Miss Quill, glancing toward the storm. "How obliging of Providence." Poirot's eyes rested upon her. "Providence, madame, is often accused when human planning has been successful." Mr. Lugg continued, "I was on my way here when a man attacked me near the old bridge, hit me from behind. I came round in a ditch. My coat was gone. My case, too." "Your case contained?" "Papers from the office. Copies only, thank God." "Thank God indeed," murmured Reverend Puddlewick, pleased to find himself professionally included. Poirot said, "Describe your attacker." "I didn't see him. Tall, I think, or perhaps I was falling." "That sometimes alters perspective," said Mr. Gorringe. Major Bletchley rounded on him. "Do you find injury amusing?" "Not at all. Only imprecision." Mrs. Crimp leaned forward, her violet dress rustling like expensive thunder. "What was in those papers?" Mr. Lugg hesitated. Poirot said, "Monsieur, there is already one man dead upstairs under your name. The hour for discretion has become unfashionable." The clerk swallowed. There was an old case, a trust, a child thought dead, money redirected. Varney handled some of the paperwork. He later claimed several respectable persons had profited. "Names," said the Major. "I was not told all of them." "How convenient," said Mrs. Crimp. "For whom?" asked Poirot. She gave him a sharp glance. Mr. Lugg shut his eyes. "There was one name I did see. Crimp." Mrs. Crimp did not move. Arnold Pye did. He gave a small jerk like a badly trained puppet. "My late husband," said Mrs. Crimp, "had enemies, creditors, and relatives. Often the same people. Which Crimp?" "Mr. Horace Crimp." "My second," she said, "dull man, excellent teeth." "Madame," said Poirot, "you knew nothing of this?" "I knew Horace had secrets. Men with excellent teeth often do. It gives them confidence." Arnold Pye stood up. "This is monstrous. My aunt cannot be expected to answer insinuations made by a concussed clerk." Mrs. Crimp looked at him. "Sit down, Arnold. Your loyalty arrives too late and sweats too much." He sat. Poirot turned to the landlord. "Monsieur Trench, this old bridge where Mr. Lugg was attacked, how far?" "Quarter mile, near the lane." "Can it be reached from the inn without passing the front?" "There's a back path. In dry weather." "Tonight?" "In tonight's weather," said Mr. Trench, "a sensible man would not." "Then we must look for an insensible one," said Poirot. "He asked for lanterns." The landlord protested. Mrs. Trench protested louder. The Major volunteered immediately, which I admired, until he added that any murderer found on the moor ought to be thrashed before being handed over. Miss Quill wished to come for literary accuracy. Poirot refused her. "Madame, if I wished for fiction, I would ask Hastings." I was hurt. We went out, Poirot, myself, the Major, Mr. Trench, and to my surprise, Mr. Gorringe. "You also, monsieur?" asked Poirot. The Undertaker smiled beneath the dripping brim of his hat. "I dislike unfinished business." The path behind the inn was a black ribbon of mud between hedges. The rain struck our faces sideways. Poirot moved with extreme care, lifting each foot as though the earth had failed an examination. Near the old bridge we found signs of a struggle. Churned mud, one broken branch, and a dark smear upon a stone. "No body," said Major Bletchley. "No," said Mr. Gorange. "A quiet evening for once." Poirot's lantern dipped. There, half buried in mud, lay a strip of brown paper and a length of string. "The parcel," I said. "Varney's fishing rods." Poirot picked up the paper. On it was a black smear, not blood, but paint or soot. "The same," he murmured. "The same as what?" "As the little flake by the fireplace." Before I could ask more, there came a cry from behind us. The landlord had found something caught in the hedge. A black coat. Its pockets had been turned inside out. Inside the lining, cut open with a knife, was a hidden slit. Empty. Mr. Lugg's stolen coat, then. But the papers were gone. When we returned to the inn, wet through and bad-tempered, the parlour door was open. Inside, everyone was standing. Iris Bell had both hands pressed to her mouth. Reverend Puddlewick looked as though prayer had finally disappointed him beyond repair. Miss Quill was pale, but her pen was moving. On the table lay a second white card. Printed upon it in the same block letters were the words, "The first death was only the correction of an error." Poirot read it once. Then he looked slowly round the room. "Mes amis," he said, "someone here has a most orderly mind." Mrs. Crimp poured herself another brandy. "Then for heaven's sake keep him away from the dinner menu." Chapter 5. A Very English Panic. The discovery of the second card produced a curious effect upon the company at the Merry Mourner. It did not make them braver, kinder, or more sensible. It made them English. By this I mean that every person in the parlour immediately pretended that nothing serious had happened, while watching everyone else as if selecting a murderer from a badly arranged menu. Mrs. Crimp drank brandy. Major Bletchley stood by the fire and pretended it was only a mere misunderstanding. Mr. Spinks offered to demonstrate the bath seat again, to relieve tension, and was silenced by general horror. Miss Euphemia Quill said, "This is the first time in my career I have found myself inside a plot and disliked the upholstery." Poirot held the second card between finger and thumb. "The first death was only the correction of an error," he read softly. "It is a phrase of vanity. The murderer does not merely kill, he edits." "Edits badly," said Miss Quill. "A death is never a correction. It is at best a revision." "Madame, you alarm me more every minute." She looked pleased. Mr. Lugg, pale on the sofa, raised himself on one elbow. "The papers must be found. If Varney's murderer has them—" "He has them," said Poirot. "How can you know?" "Because he tells us so." He touched the card. "The first death was only the correction of an error. That is not written by a frightened man. It is written by one who believes he now understands the game." Iris Bell shuddered. "Then Varney came here to blackmail someone." "Not someone," said Poirot. "Several someones, perhaps." Mrs. Crimp set down her glass. "If that is meant to include me, Monsieur Poirot, say it plainly. I have buried better men than my second husband and worse accusations than this." "Madame, did Horace Crimp ever speak of a trust, a lost child, or a solicitor named Varney?" "No." "Did he leave money?" "He left debts, a stuffed pike, and 2 silver-backed brushes with his initials on them. If there was a fortune, he had the tact to conceal it from his widow." Arnold Pye said, "Aunt Lavinia has no connection to this." Poirot turned to him. "You are very sure?" "I know my aunt." Mrs. Crimp gave a dry laugh. You know my checkbook, Arnold. Do not overstate intimacy. The young man flushed a deep, unhealthy red. Poirot's eyes moved on. Major Bletchley, you also recognize the name Varney? The Major gave a start so violent that the fire spat. No. You are certain? Quite. That is a pity. You looked as though you had. I knew a Varney in India, snapped the Major. Different fellow, shot badly. At birds? At everything. That must have been inconvenient for those near him. The Major glowered. Poirot then turned to Mr. Gorringe. The Undertaker stood near the window, his pale hands folded, his expression one of polite attendance upon human foolishness. And you, monsieur? I knew no Varney. But the word correction interested you. It is an undertaker's habit to notice final language. Final language? People speak strangely around death. They say past when they mean died, sleeping when they mean gone, and better place when they mean anywhere but here. A precise murderer is almost refreshing. Reverend Puddlewick whispered, refreshing. In vocabulary only. The curate looked as though he regretted having entered the church instead of the stationery trade. Poirot asked to see the card again under the lamp. He placed it beside the first one, which he had carefully kept. The block letters were similar but not identical. Hastings, he said. What do you observe? I studied them. They are the same. No? Then different. That is not observation. That is escape. I looked closer. The letters on the second card were heavier, more uneven. The second was written in a hurry. Good. And with another pen. Miss Quill leaned forward. So 2 writers? Or 1 writer under 2 emotions? That is not bad, she admitted. I may steal it? You will not, madam. Poirot then made a request that caused fresh indignation. Each person was to produce any pen, pencil, ink bottle, notebook, envelope, or personal paper in their possession. You cannot search ladies, said Major Bletchley. I do not search ladies. I invite ladies to prove themselves less murderous than gentlemen. Mrs. Crimp opened her handbag with majestic contempt. It contained smelling salts, a purse, 3 letters, a small silver flask, and a hat-pin of such length that I silently reclassified her as a military power. Miss Quill produced 5 pencils, 2 notebooks, an ink pen, and a folded page headed, Possible Motives for Everyone. Poirot confiscated it on principle. Mr. Spinks had order forms, a pencil stub, and an illustrated advertisement showing a cheerful invalid seated upon one of his collapsible inventions. It folds flat, he said. So, eventually do we all, said Mr. Gorringe. Reverend Puddlewick had only a Bible and a fountain pen that leaked. Major Bletchley had a pipe, matches, and a small notebook filled with complaints about modern railway service. Arnold Pye had nothing but a damp handkerchief. Poirot looked at him. No pen, monsieur? No. You do not write? Not unless obliged. A philosophy shared by many government departments. Lastly, Iris Bell opened her little travelling case. Inside were clean gloves, a cheap comb, and a packet of old letters tied with faded blue ribbon. At the sight of the ribbon, Mr. Lugg made a small sound. Poirot heard it. You recognize those letters? No, said Lugg too quickly. Iris clutched them. They are mine. From whom? Asked Poirot. My father. May I see them? She hesitated, then handed them over. Poirot untied the ribbon with surprising gentleness. The letters were old, worn at the folds, written in a fine hand. He read only a little, then stopped. Mademoiselle, your father's name? Henry Bell. And your mother? She looked bewildered. Clara. Poirot folded the letters again. Merci. What is it? I asked. Nothing yet, Hastings. Nothing is a very important stage. Before anyone could press him further, Mrs. Trench appeared at the door. "There's someone in number 3. The effect was electric. "Nonsense," said the landlord. "I locked it." I heard movement. We went upstairs in a body, which is to say that no one wished to go and no one wished to be left behind. The door of number 3 was locked. The landlord unlocked it. The room was empty. The dead Varney still lay upon the bed beneath a sheet. The fire had burned lower. Rain tapped at the window. Then Miss Quill gave a small, sharp cry. The sheet had moved. Major Bletchley swore. Reverend Puddlewick crossed himself, which seemed denominationally uncertain. Poirot stepped forward and lifted the sheet. From beneath the bed scrambled Mr. Spinks's collapsible bath seat. Or rather, the bath seat opened itself with a hideous metallic snap, propelled by some spring disturbed under the bed, and struck the landlord smartly on the shin. Mr. Trench howled. Mr. Spinks looked deeply moved. "That is the new safety release." Mrs. Crimp said, "Then I prefer danger." But Poirot was not laughing. He knelt by the bed and drew out the thing the spring had revealed, a narrow blackened rod, about 2 feet long, wrapped at one end in cloth. There was blood upon it. "The weapon," I said. Poirot shook his head. "No, Hastings, not the weapon." He turned it slightly, and we saw painted on the blackened wood, almost hidden beneath soot, a name. Bell. Iris gave a cry and fell back against the wall. At the same moment, from downstairs, came the sound of a door opening and shutting. Someone had left the inn. Some stories are meant not only to be heard, but to be kept. We're very happy to share that Nocturnal Tales, The Collected Mysteries, Volume 2, is now available as an e-book. This second volume brings together 8 of our earliest mysteries, all substantially rewritten, expanded, and carefully edited for the page. These are not simple transcripts of the audiobook episodes. We've gone back through every story, reworked the structure, tightened the prose, improved the clues, and brought them closer to the standard of our more recent work. The result is a proper collected edition, 906 pages, 8 complete mysteries, and an original Art Deco illustration for every story. With every purchase, you receive both EPUB and PDF formats, so you can read on Kindle, Kobo, Apple Books, tablets, or desktop. Volume 2 is available now for $3.99 through Patreon, Gumroad, and Buy Me a Coffee. And this is only the beginning. We have more than 150 stories in the Nocturnal Tales catalogue, and our plan is to keep preserving them in collected ebook editions. So, if you'd like to support our work and build your own Nocturnal Tales library, Volume 2 is ready now. Thank you, as always, for listening, reading, and supporting the stories. Chapter 6. The Corpse Corrects the Living. We rushed downstairs with that absurd courage which comes from arriving too late. The front door stood open. Rain blew in across the hall in silver sheets. On the hook beside the door, one coat was missing. "Arnold," said Mrs. Crimp. She did not cry out. She did not faint. She said his name as she might have said, "The pudding has fallen." Major Bletchley seized a lantern. "I'll fetch the young pup back." "You will remain," said Poirot. The Major bristled. "A murderer is escaping." "No. A frightened man is escaping. There is a difference, though not always, to the frightened man." Mrs. Crimp had risen. For the first time that evening she looked old. "Bring him back, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot bowed slightly. "Hastings and I shall go. No one else leaves this room." Mr. Goring smiled. "A pity. I had hoped to stretch my legs." "You have stretched already too far, monsieur." The Undertaker's smile did not change, but something behind it did. We found Arnold Pye within 10 minutes, not far from the bridge, sitting in a ditch and sobbing with a blackthorn branch across his knees. He was wet, muddy, and as murderous-looking as a drowned accountant. "I didn't kill him," he said at once. "No," said Poirot. "But you ran because you knew who he was." Arnold stared at him. "Varney came to your aunt's second husband years ago," said Poirot. "Horace Crimp was one of the trustees who concealed the Bell money. You knew enough to be afraid, but not enough to kill. I thought if the papers came out, Aunt Lavinia would be ruined." "Your aunt," I said, "appears difficult to ruin." "She already knew," said Arnold miserably, and there in the rain Mrs. Crimp's earlier composure became clear. She had not been innocent of knowledge. She had merely been innocent of surprise. We brought Arnold back. Poirot assembled us in the parlour. It was near midnight. The fire had sunk low. The storm battered the inn as though the weather itself had been refused service. Poirot placed 3 objects on the table, the 2 white cards and the blackened rod marked Bell. "Mes amis," he began, "the case has been made to look complicated because the murderer is a man with the artistic temperament of a coffin-maker." Mr. Goringer said softly, "That is almost personal." "It is entirely personal." The room tightened. Poirot continued, "Paul Varney came here to blackmail several people connected to an old fraud. Many years ago a child named Iris Bell was declared dead. She was not dead. Money placed in trust for her was misused by respectable persons, including the late Horace Crimp. Varney knew this. He summoned the guilty, the useful and the ignorant together." Iris whispered, "Declared dead?" "Yes, mademoiselle. That is why the first card said, 'One of us is already dead.' It did not mean a corpse upstairs. It meant you. Legally on paper, you had been dead for years." Mrs. Crimp closed her eyes briefly. "Horace, you miserable little ferret." Poirot turned to Mr. Goringer. "But there was another man in the old affair, the Undertaker." Mr. Goringer gave a little bow. "We are useful at endings." "You were useful at a false ending. A coffin was buried, a certificate was accepted, a child disappeared from the record. You were paid." Major Bletchley thundered, "You ghoul!" "Ghouls dig people up. I put them away," said Goringer. "Silence," said Poirot. It was softly said, but it stopped him. "Varney came with proof," Poirot went on. "Not fishing rods in brown paper, but a piece taken from the old false coffin, a blackened wooden rail from the Bell burial, kept because it bore the name. He had preserved it as insurance. It was not the murder weapon. It was evidence." I stared at the rod. "Then the blood?" "Added later. A clumsy attempt to point toward Iris Bell. The soot flake by the fireplace told me the rod had been hidden in the chimney after the murder, then moved again." Mr. Goringer understood death, but he understood housekeeping less well. Miss Quill murmured, "That is often where criminals fail." Poirot nodded. "Precisely." Mr. Goringer's pale hands rested on the back of a chair. "You have no proof." "I have more than that. I have vanity. You wrote the first card in advance, using Varney's own phrase, taken from his papers. You intended to frighten the company and recover the documents, but when Mr. Lugg arrived alive, the situation changed. You had killed Varney, but not destroyed the danger, so you wrote the second card in haste." "The first death was only the correction of an error," said Miss Quill. "Yes, that phrase betrayed you. It is not a young man's panic, nor a widow's anger, nor a novelist's ornament. It is professional language twisted into philosophy. To you, a false burial was an administrative mistake. Murder was merely correction." Mr. Goring laughed once. It was a dry, elegant sound. "And Mr. Lugg?" "You attacked him near the bridge before he reached the inn. You stole his coat and case. You thought the papers were inside, but Lugg had brought copies. Varney still held the better proof. So you killed Varney upstairs before dinner ended during your absence to wash your hands. A very Undertaker-like alibi. Cleanliness after contact. Mrs. Crimp said, "You cold-blooded creature." He looked at her. "Madame, your husband bought my silence. Do not sneer at wholesale rates after purchasing retail." For once, Mrs. Crimp had no answer. Poirot's voice hardened. "You then tried to place suspicion on Iris. You used the bell rail, smeared it, hid it badly, and arranged that it should be found. But you made one error." "Only one?" asked Goringer. "You assumed death makes people quiet. It does not. Death makes the living talk." He turned to Iris. "Mademoiselle Belle, you will have much restored to you. Money, perhaps. Reputation, certainly. Peace, eventually." Iris looked at the blackened rod and said, "I should rather like breakfast first." Mrs. Crimp nodded. Sensible girl. The police arrived at dawn, along with a mechanic, a doctor, and a man from the coach company who insisted the accident was most irregular, as though murder had been merely poor scheduling. Mr. Goringer was taken away without struggle. At the door he paused. "Monsieur Poirot, had I killed no one, I would still have been punished." Poirot looked at him gravely. "Yes, but less neatly." That seemed to wound him more than the arrest. By noon the storm had cleared. The coach, missing a wheel and most of its dignity, was declared unfit. Poirot received this news with relief. "We return by train, Hastings." "And the country air?" He brushed an imaginary speck of mud from his sleeve. "The country air has made its point. I shall not argue with it further." As we left the Merry Mourner, Mrs. Crimp was ordering breakfast for everyone with the authority of a field marshal. "Eggs," she commanded, "toast, coffee, and no sentiment. I have had 3 husbands and 1 murder before luncheon. I refuse to face the police on weak tea." Poirot smiled. "You see, Hastings, the English character? Strong? No, my friend, indigestible." Thank you for listening all the way to the end of The Undertaker's Holiday. This was a case in which death was not an event but a profession, and Mr. Septimus Goringer practiced it with the quiet pride of a craftsman. Years ago, he had buried an empty coffin, signed a false certificate, and made a living child vanish from the record so that respectable men could steal her trust fund. When Paul Varney arrived with proof, Goringer did what undertakers do. He tidied the mess away. The murder weapon was never found because it hardly mattered. What mattered was the blackened wooden rail marked Bell, kept for years as insurance, smeared with blood, and planted to frame the very girl who had been declared dead. Our detective saw through it because he noticed the professional language. "The first death was only the correction of an error," is not a phrase a panicked man invents. It is the philosophy of a man who has made a career of endings. What lingers, though, is not the horror, but the company. Mrs. Crimp ordering breakfast for everyone after a murder with the authority of a field marshal. Miss Quill producing a list of possible motives for the entire party. The Reverend Puddlewick crossing himself with denominational uncertainty. Mr. Spinks's collapsible bath seat springing open beneath a corpse and striking the landlord on the shin. And through it all, a small Belgian detective sitting very upright, patent leather shoes together, observing that the English character is not strong, merely indigestible. The case asked whether death makes people quiet, and the answer, delivered by 9 stranded passengers in a crooked inn during a biblical storm, is a resounding no. If this kind of mystery stayed with you, the one set in rain-battered inns where the corpse is upstairs, the suspects are all downstairs arguing about gravy, and the Undertaker smiles too softly. Tell us in the comments when you first suspected Mr. Goringer, and which of the passengers you would least like to be stranded with. Tell us, too, where you'd like us to go next. More country inns, more storms, more locked rooms with collapsible bath seats, or something entirely different. And if you'd like to support Nocturnal Tales and help keep these full-length mysteries coming, you'll find links in the description for Patreon and for one-off tips via Buy Me a Coffee or PayPal. Our ebook, Nocturnal Tales, The Collected Mysteries, Volume 2, is also available for $3.99 on Patreon, Gumroad, and Buy Me a Coffee. For now, thank you again for staying with us to the last line. Until the next case, be wary of men who smile at funerals they did not attend. Never trust a holiday that promises silence, and remember, the most dangerous person in the room is not the one who fears death, but the one who has made a tidy living from it.